What you looking at? It is Dave Allred, the real barman here, and today we will be discussing my favorite of all the hooches, bourbon whiskey. All right, that's enough of that. That is my version of a southern hillbilly, but accents aren't really my thing. I'm not very good at them, so I'm gonna stop now. But it's true, bourbon is my favorite of all the spirits, and I will often head over to my brother-in-law's house because he has a large array of scotches and bourbons, and we'll sit there and we'll sniff it, and then we'll take a sip and we'll say things like, man, that's smooth, man. And then we'll sniff it again and we'll say, man, I detect hints of leather and dish rag, I don't know, whatever. Total douchebag stuff, but sometimes it's fun to be a dork, so I do it. When I drink my bourbon, I have to have it ice cold. So at my brother-in-law's, we get the big ball of ice, the giant one, we put it in there, at least I do. I've always had to have my drinks ice cold, it's just me. If they had bourbon Slurpees, I would totally, like if 7-Eleven had like a bourbon Slurpee machine, I would totally pick one up like every day. Along with one of those like beef jerkies that they have in the bin that everyone paws and gets germs and their nastiness all over it. Sounds kind of good right now. Okay, so back to bourbon. What is bourbon exactly? Bourbon is American whiskey. That's its definition. It does not have to be made in Kentucky like a lot of people think. It can be made anywhere. It can be made in South Dakota. You can make South Dakota bourbon. You cannot put a label on your South Dakota bourbon that says Kentucky bourbon, but you can call it bourbon because that's what it is. Does that make sense? However, with that said, as of 2014, 95% of bourbon is made in Kentucky. So I don't even know why we mentioned the other states where it's made, except for Jack Daniel's I'll mention because it is the #1 selling American whiskey in the United States. They want nothing to do with calling their whiskey bourbon. They call it Tennessee whiskey, and they filter it through these 10-foot stacks of sugar maple charcoal, which is what gives it its distinct flavor. So bourbon came about in the early 1800s, and by 1870s, people from Kentucky were using it as a regular thing. So there's one legend that says that Elijah Craig invented bourbon, as well as the process of putting it in charred oak barrels, which is what makes it brown and gives it its flavor. Other people say that's just legend, and that Jacob Spears was the first one to start calling it bourbon. Other historians say that the name came from Bourbon Street in New Orleans, where they had a port there and they sold a lot of Kentucky whiskey. So let's talk about what makes bourbon bourbon. In 1964, the US decided that bourbon should be our little gift to the world and we should claim it as our own. So in order for it to be bourbon, as we mentioned before, it has to be made in the US. So let's go over the US standards for what makes bourbon bourbon.
Okay, so I know you can read, but in case you've been drinking bourbon, I'm going to read this to you. So, based on United States law, bourbon must be made from a grain of mixture of at least 51% corn. We mentioned this already. It must be aged in new charred oak barrels. These are usually white American oak barrels, distilled to no more than 160 proof and bottled at 80 proof or more. In addition, bourbon has no minimum duration for aging, with the exception of straight bourbon, which must be aged at least 2 years. And then anything aged less than 4 years must say so on the bottle. And then finally, blended bourbons can add coloring or neutral spirits, but it must still contain at least 51% straight bourbon.
Okay, let's talk production. As we mentioned, it has to be at least 51% corn. They will add water, they'll mash it up, they'll add yeast, and then they'll let it ferment for a while. At this point, they're going to distill it down to 130 to 160 proof, and that resulting clear liquid that comes out they call white dog. And now at this point, they're going to put it in the newly charred oak barrels. Has to be new, you can't put it in the used one, and it's going to give it its color and its flavor. Once they bring that out, they're going to dilute it with water and bottle it at least 80 proof, or it's not bourbon. You can bottle it at less than 80 proof, but it has to be on the label diluted bourbon, or it's not legal. And the last thing I'll mention is that after processing, a lot of these barrels will have bourbon soaked into them, into the staves, a lot of times 2 or 3 gallons, and we can't use the barrels again for bourbon. I've already mentioned that, so we'll sell them to distilleries in Canada and Mexico and the Caribbean and Scotland and Ireland, and they can use it for aging other spirits. It's also used for other barrel-aged stuff. They make barrel-aged beer, they do wine and it gives a good flavor. Even hot sauce, barbecue sauce, all sorts of shit that makes really good flavor products. So there's your lesson on bourbon for the day. I'm Dave, the Real Barman. Subscribe to my YouTube channel. Visit me at therealbarman.com. I'll see y'all. I'm out.